what stood out for you? For Puay, Ramlee, and for Chris. Puay first.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Okay, I look at it from the charities perspective. Okay. Now, I think we all come after this whole presentation, and I'm sure Charities Unit has shared with us previously the importance of having whistleblowing, right? So I think the why we should have is very clear to all of us. So the next question is, how do we do it? How do we go about setting a whistleblowing policy? How do we communicate? How do we train our colleagues in terms of this whistleblowing policy? And then with very limited resources that we have. So I've done several governance review for charities, and we are aware that charities have very limited resource because there's always this dynamo. Do I spend my money for the beneficiary, or do I spend money on this, right? So I think the question here is, how can we go forward?
Okay, we'll come to the how in a second. Ramlee, come on into the picture. I'll have to go sort of in a linear form because we only have 2 mics to share.
Knowing Melvin, he's always very systematic and organizer. Anyway, I think it was an interesting talk by Carla. Really appreciate that. What stand out for me was one thing. Everybody knows about the benefit of whistleblowing and so forth. I agree that the size of the organization is not only in terms of resources, but in terms of number of people. If you're a small charity with a limited number of people, I think when you whistleblow, most probably everybody knows. Nothing is kept a secret. And I think that's one of the things that really stop people from actually coming forward. The thing that really interests me further is the fact that while we always keep talking about protection of whistleblower, I think there must be some thought about the person being accused. Okay, and I think in all whistleblowing policies and so forth, this has never been a point of discussion, because I've seen in my lifetime cases that brought up and found that the allegation were not true, but careers were destroyed. And so therefore, I think there must be something there to actually protect the accuser as well.
Okay, I'm sure the lawyer is going to agree with you. We'll come to Carla in a second because of, hearing 2 sides of the story. But first, Chris, your thoughts.
I think first of all, I'd like to thank Carla for a very enlightening and very comprehensive talk on the whistleblowing. I did a lot of regional work, and I found that actually a lot of the whistleblowing, unfortunately, was not really sort of founded on facts. And quite a bit was actually very atrocious against certain people because they wanted to get rid of some people. And so this is the downside of the whistleblowing. But of course, the positive side is that whistleblowing is more effective than any internal audit or external audit, because I got the figures here that whistleblowing actually reviewed 39.1% of the frauds, while internal audit only caught 16.5%, and external audit is a lot worse. So it's a bit unfortunate. I wouldn't like to belabor the point, but I think what I'm trying to say is that although there are a lot of negative problems associated with the whistleblowing still remains a very effective tool for us.
Okay, I think from the panel there are 3 accountants or auditors sitting here plus 1 lawyer, right? So you know who the background or what the background will be. Okay, so I'm glad you spoke about that, because I think we want to break down some of those issues. But first, maybe at the highest level, do you think Singapore needs an overarching legislation for whistleblowing? This is a point that Carla made in her presentation. There is none currently. So the point is, do we need one? Chris first.
Personally, I would really think that this is critical, because if there's no protection, I mean, like the guy who is at the marine case, right? Can you imagine he's trying to do something good for the society, and yet he ended up being messed up, yeah? And although the legislation is very important, I went to do quite a bit of research on the UK whistleblowing. Unfortunately, in the UK, despite the legislation, most of the whistleblowers were either termed as insane, something wrong with this guy, poor performer and so on. At the end, all these people had to leave. So it's very sad. So the legislation is there to protect them, but it didn't seem to be effective at the end of the day because they were all booted out. Yeah, that's very sad.
So this is a question of course, having the law there, but yet people are victims of demonization. Ramlee, what do you think?
Unfortunately, in this case, I do agree that the law is required. Regulation is the first step. I think the enforcement is important, how we do actually manage it and protect the whistleblower. It's easier said than done, I think. And at the end of the day, like I say, it goes back to a small organization. If you're working there and nobody's going to talk to you, it's going to be a living hell. You know, and the mental strain and pressure to that person is significant. You cannot downplay that part of it.
Puay?
Okay, having the law certainly helps, but I think it's really the culture of speaking out. I think in Asia, especially in Singapore, I think many of us do not want to speak out because when you speak out, you fear that there will be reprisal and so forth, right? So we must encourage people to speak out. And when we speak out, we actually encourage them to speak out with facts. We're not accusing people, but we actually speak out and then with an interest in mind. So the culture of speaking out, encouraging people. So there must be trust. Okay, so when people speak out, yes, they may be wrong, right? We explain to them why is it wrong, and so there must be open discussion. So I really believe in open discussion. And for charity sector, I think that is important because when you discuss, open discussion, that's where we improve. Right.
Carla, come into the picture here. It is building on what the three panelists have also said, but it's this question of, you are kind of, if you pardon the French, damn if you do, damn if you don't. If you have legislation that allows you to whistleblow, but yet you have to suffer the consequences later of, being ostracized, being made to, face certain humiliation and things like that. I think Ramlee brought in this point, which is the question of, if it's going to be so difficult, and you said it in your presentation as well, you probably will not be able to continue working in the organization had you done this. So you're doing the right thing, but at the same time, you may not be able to live there, work there, or even find a job. You mentioned Singapore, very small, gets around. Your thoughts?
I think we need to come at this from multiple angles. So I don't say this because I'm a lawyer, but I think, unfortunately, rules are necessary. So rules means legislation. It's necessary when you're trying to change mindsets and a culture. So you do need that. But legislation without proper enforcement and follow-through does not work. And that's why the UK issue as well. I think proper enforcement, the commitment to enforce is important. The legislation needs to address both issues, the whistleblower protection, but yet protection of the accused as well. And how you can do that is not just ride on something very thin. So you don't start investigating the moment you have something, a simple statement coming up. Require at least a degree of evidence and then move on. Because that then accords the accused a protection as well. And then that's one angle. So that's one critical angle and what it can cover, plus the enforcement. The other angle is exactly what you have said. You have to have training, communication, how this is going to work, so that the employees understand, the employers understand, but also if it's going to be an overarching legislation, the enforcers need to understand. And it works as a composite whole that way.
Vijay, come on in. What do you think? Oh, Ramlee, you wanted to add first.
The other thing that can help the situation is the fact that for charities to have good board members who understands the issues of the day and the need for transparency and able to translate that into a culture that they can build throughout the organization. I think individual board members have a role to play in this part.
Okay, since you brought up the role of the board member, I will press you on this one. When you talk about building culture, it is a little bit more than just a process. It is more than 5 steps to build culture. In your view, what is that going to entail to try to get that culture of whistleblowing right?
Okay, I think simple thing, for example, the board must make sure there are obviously internal control procedures and so forth, making sure For example, in purchasing, there could be 3 or 4 quotes and so forth. Then the other part of it is also to be able to communicate to staff and ensure that everybody in the organization understand the whistleblowing policy, ensure protection, and make sure that when there is a case coming to the board, they should at least be seen, or in fact, they should be taking action to it. Whether at the end of the day telling the whistleblower that there is no evidence, the case is closed, keeping the people involved up to date, that makes sense. And once you go 1 or 2 cycles of that, I think the senior management and the staff would understand that the board is serious about it. And if there are real wrongdoing, then action should be taken, appropriate action should be taken. So it's just not lip service, but actually showing through by action that whistleblowing is something serious.
Okay, appreciate what's your perspective. You also mentioned building the culture.
Yeah. You see, I think the tone from the top is really important. How the directors or the board actually share, and then the action and so forth. Now, when I look at the whistleblowing policy about the need, the requirement for disclosure and so forth, what come to my mind was, for some charities, the easy way out is really look at the template, right? I put a template out and I just say we adopt it and so forth. But really, I think to have it and to actually make sure that the charities do roll out a proper and effective whistleblowing, I think the directors or the board plays a very important role.
Okay, Chris, come on in. Building a culture of whistleblowing.
Actually, on culture, it's quite interesting to observe that a lot of times people say Asian culture, we are very averse to whistleblowing. However, I strongly object to this because when I travel to Indonesia, I tell you the amount of whistleblowing is like, the whole mountain, I just can't fly through it. In China, I've been sent videos of people being entertained in KTVs and all that. So I don't think that whistleblowing is adverse, is something that the Asian culture, doesn't like. I think it's really the whistleblowers want to see that the action is being taken on their complaints. As soon as when they send in the complaint, of course they have to back it by videos or by whatever, and then action is taken very quickly. That actually reinforces this. So if you say that, we believe in this and so on, it really doesn't help. But as long as first case in and first case being settled, that will send a very good signal.
Okay, I hope this is not a naughty question. You mentioned Asian culture, of course, Asian experience. You cited Indonesia, you cited China. Around this room, we are uniquely Singapore. How do you think we can do that in Singapore?
Yeah. Actually, I again did some research, and it's interesting that Singaporeans don't like to whistleblow internally, but they have the guts to whistleblow to the police and the CPIB. Because you look at the number of cases to CPIB, it's over 800 cases. That means there's tons of whistleblowers around. So why is that? That means there is no trust in the management or the board of certain organizations. So it's a bit negative, but I think it is also something that we need to take note and to see how this can be improved. Because there's so many cases going to CPIB. Why? And I tell you, when CPIB investigates, they say that they ask you to lim kopi, to drink coffee, but it's a lot more serious than that.
Okay, let's send the mic down because to your point, I think all 3 of your fellow panelists chuckled. So I just want to hear their thoughts. Carla first. She's raring to go, by the way.
Not quite. Actually, I think it's not so much about Asian culture or Western culture and so on, but I do agree that there is a culture of not saying it to someone not saying it internally, because the fear of losing that anonymity, I think, comes about. The external complaints is because it's all anonymous and no one knows you're the one who did it. The MPA case is just a very unfortunate case. Another aspect, I think, where things have changed, and I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, is social media. Whistleblowing through social media has become a huge thing, and any sort of overarching legislation that we put in place needs to take that into account as well, in the sense of how do you investigate something that's put on social media. Not looking at the harassment side of issues, because we have a law that deals with that. So that's another angle I just want to sort of put out there. And I want to re-emphasize the point about, it's not about just the law alone. The law is important, but there must be enforcement. So if I put a policy in place internally, ignoring legislation, internally I need to show that there's enforcement. So the point that was made was, if I make a complaint, I want to know it's being investigated. One of the policies I put in place, we went into a lot of details, right down to within X number of days, there will be someone that will come back to you. Is this going to be looked into further? Is it not? If it is not, maybe a quick one-liner explanation, why not? If it's going to be looked into further, opportunity to be heard with additional evidence. But the accused gets an opportunity to be heard as well. And then the process continues with proper timelines put in place, proper documentation put in place. I know it's tedious, but when you do it that way and you make it transparent, people start to believe that it could work. And this brings up issues, and it's not about fraud, it's not about corruption, that's just one aspect. It is about a whole range of other issues that come up. It's sometimes just something, I think I'm doing right, but actually I'm doing wrong, and I need someone to tell me, Kala, wake up, you're doing wrong. And nobody has the courage, the whistleblowing helps. So sometimes it's just that.
Puay, your thoughts?
Okay, so actually what comes to it is the policy is very important. What do you put in that policy? So maybe I do a bit of selling here. Yeah. Okay.
Within reason.
Okay. No, that's where we work together with the Charities unit. So we got Prof. Fu Siliang from SMU together with IIA. We developed a whistleblowing toolkit. Okay. And in there we actually address all these issues. That what should be in your whistleblowing policy. So some of the issues that we've discussed just now and also in the presentation, we captured inside there. Okay, so this toolkit will be available in the Charities website very soon. Okay, currently there's some migration, I think, on the website. So if you want it very urgently, you can always write to Charities unit to ask for a copy of this toolkit.
So actually, I will allow a little bit more since there was a practical point to that. If you were to look at the top 3 things of that toolkit, what will it be as very practical advice for people around this room trying to go down the route of having a good whistleblowing policy within their organizations?
Okay, so I think what we did was we actually go through the process. So there are 4 steps to the process, so it's a very systematic. But I think for charities, we figured out that we probably have a lot of, you see, there's a lot of training because you are just starting the journey. So there'll be a lot of confusion between what is a personal grievance versus what is a whistleblowing issue, right? So in that guide, toolkit itself, we actually gave some examples. So we hope that this toolkit is being used by everybody and they can read. So even the employee itself can read it and say that, oh, this personal grievance, if I think my bonus is not justified, okay, I'll go to my own supervisor. It will not be a whistleblowing issue, right? So it's captured in there. Then a very systematic process in terms of we're trying to get independence in this whole process. So we have a staff receiving the report. Then we have a whistleblowing governance officer. And then of course we have investigation. And then finally the closure part of it. So, and the involvement of AC. So all this will be all captured in that toolkit.
Okay, Ramlee, I'll bring you into the picture for the moment because it's back to that part of the discussion that we were having about how do you encourage people to whistleblow. And, Chris was citing the Indonesian as well as the Chinese example, and I asked about Singapore.
I wish life was that simple. From my personal experience, I think there is a change in Singaporean culture. I think the younger ones are a little more outspoken. And I don't know whether it's exposure or the need to do good in the community is stronger in the younger generation, whereas during my time it's about working and feeding the family. If I lose my job, that's a problem. But the younger generation, if I lose my job, I got my parents to take care of me, isn't it? Most of the time. So it's not so much of pressure. So I think there's a change. But again, having the protection and having a good whistleblowing policy on an organization is important. While the guideline will be good, I'm hoping that the guideline will be simple. It's not too legal, not too many forms to fill. From a perspective of a whistleblower, if I'm a whistleblower, I want to know what are things I can whistleblow on. 2, how am I going to be protected? 3, what are the processes in place? Who do I go to? Now, if I'm going into someone, it's a problem, and you guess what? The whistleblower officer is the HR person. Would you be comfortable? So the charity needs to think whether it should go to the board level, straight audit committee chairman maybe, or the chairman himself. So someone outside the organization would be a better avenue than within the organization, because I tell you, words spread out very easily in the organization. So these are simple things that I think can help encourage people to speak out.
Okay, and encouraging people to speak out. I think the word anonymous was mentioned during the discussion here. Now, in your view, in order to prevent abuse, is anonymous better, or the person ought to be named? Bearing in mind, of course, the NPA case where the person was named because you're in court documents and whatever. It was meant to have been anonymous, but something didn't go right. But the overall question here is more about, is anonymous whistleblowing better, or because you need to protect the individual, that the person who's whistleblowing ought to be named? What are your thoughts? Chris first.
Well, generally speaking, the whistleblower is seldom anonymous, because the reason is that it is unlikely that all the facts needed for investigation will be presented on the first call. So there is always a need to talk to the person and so on. At the end of the day, I think the identity of the person will be known to the person handling the whistleblowing. But what we mean by anonymous is really to protect the identity of the whistleblower. So in that case, if you have a hotline that's meant internally, it is even harder for you to protect the identity of the whistleblower. And that's why, in a way, charities may need to consider outsourcing the hotline management to protect the identity of the whistleblower. Because in this way, when the whistleblower gives facts and evidence, the whistleblower does not have the fear that I'm talking to someone who may be a friend of this particular individual, or even to the board, because the board may sort of work very well with certain people, and they may not feel comfortable in talking to even the AC chair or the chairman of the board, because if, let's say, the CEO works very closely with the board, and then you are going to whistleblow on the CEO, I think the staff will sort of fear that, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Ramlee, you have a lot of experience with boards.
No, I get Chris' point with regards to board working closely, but if you look at charity, most of us are on the board pro bono. We don't get paid, so there's no real interest for us to hide anything. And most of the guys on the board have got reputation to maintain. And I've worked, or the charities that are involved in the board have put serious thought on transparency and internal control. The part about anonymous, I think it's very difficult to take action if you don't know who the complaint is, because who do you go for evidence and so forth. And in fact, in some cases, I think most companies in corporate world, if it's anonymous, it may not get any action done. It'll be thrown dustbin, unless it's really serious claim, then they will try to look into it. But normally it's very difficult to take action.
Okay, Carla reacted to a point from you about board directors not having any interest in hiding anything.
Actually, can I pick up anonymity first? When I talk about anonymous personally, it's actually more confidential, keeping the person confidential, but not an anonymous complaint. I think the person making the complaint, the whistleblower, needs to be able to put his and say who he is and so on, but trust that the system will keep him confidential. The board issue, I do sit on actually more than one pro bono boards, whether charities or otherwise, but pro bono boards. And I think at the end of the day, if we accept a position, you got to recognize that you are accepting it because you have a job to do. It is a job, like it or not. And so if there is something you don't like, sorry, I talk a lot, you got to stand up for it. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. And for charities out there, you need to be making sure that you're getting board members who are truly going to stand up and speak out. It's tougher, really. I know it's damn bloody hard, pardon the language, but you board members that way because the tone is set at the top. And just one last point in relation to boards is, please don't go with old board like the for-profit organizations do. It doesn't make sense. And don't go with old girl networks as well. Find the right boy or the right man or the right girl for the job. There was another point. It slipped out. It'll come back. Important.
Okay, I'll bring Puay into the picture. If it comes back to you, we'll go there.
Okay, regarding being
Anonymity,
confidential,
yeah.
I think when you put in the system for whistleblowing, we got to try to keep the whole process confidential in the sense that we don't want to share and publicize the person's name, the whistleblower's name. So you have to make sure to put inside the process that the whistleblowing governance officer and the other people involved in the whole process have to keep the information confidential. Okay, So the whistleblower can put his name down, but he has to trust that the process keep his name confidential all the way through. Okay, so that's very important. The second point regarding getting an outside party to receive the whistleblowing, the complaint, and so forth, I think it can be costly, right? So we're very mindful it can be costly. Now, to me, whether you need to go all the way to get the external party or an internal one depends on your risk assessment of the situation. If your track record, you actually have previous cases of, fraud or some of this misconduct happened before, then you know the risk could be high. So if that's the case, maybe it's worthwhile putting the money and getting an external party. But for your organization, you think the risk is low, you do a risk assessment, you think it's slow, then you can keep it within internal. But of course, internally, you have to make sure the checks and balances are there.
Okay, at this point, I want to open the floor to questions. Does anyone want to jump in? You've got questions written, you want to send them to me, I can ask them for you, or you can also stand up and ask the panel. Very good thoughts around the group here. They all have different perspectives, but it'll be good if they can also help to answer some of the burning questions that you've got. Anyone? See what I mean by uniquely Singapore? Nobody wants to speak up. So feel free. I mean, this is an open forum. Okay, sir.
Hello. I have been tasked by my board to formulate a whistleblowing policy. And I think part of the intent is to make that policy public because we do not want to exclude external stakeholders. So my question is, when I publish that approved policy, do I also need to include very detailed investigation process? How for example, the audit committee is going to investigate any feedback? Do I need to do that?
Okay, you want to tell us where you're from? We won't disclose out of this room.
Yes, I'm from AMKFSE Community Services.
Okay, so who might be best placed to jump on this one? Cheh first. Difficult question.
Okay, the toolkit that we have in there is actually quite a simple one because when we started the journey of getting this done, we were deliberating, do we give a very detailed one? And is it meant for the bigger charities or do we give the base case? So we actually come up with a very simple one. Not a lot of details required to be in there based on our toolkit, but it's really up to you. you must put enough information for the whistleblower to know who to contact. And you want to assure him that the process is confidential. So you must make sure the essential information must be in there. But I think that the investigation process and the details is really internal to you. So it's really up to you whether you want to actually make known to the public.
Carla?
Sorry, just a slightly different view. There's no right or wrong, but I would suggest simplicity, very important. But I would also at least have a few lines in terms of what the process is going to be like. And the reason why I say that is because it comes down to transparency. I want to know that something's being done. And I might not be notified, but at least when I look at the policy, I know that, okay, it's going through this route. And if I needed to, I can call out and say, so which stage is it at? Because I know that's what you're going to do. And it doesn't go into just a huge ocean and disappear in there. So it ties into the transparency.
Okay. Anyone else? Gentlemen, you'd like to jump in? Chris?
I think the idea of opening out to the external stakeholders is very good, but it's also a lot of courage because for certain organizations, they may be flooded. Okay, I'll just tell you one organization that has got 4 letters, starts with S and then ends with a T. Yeah, so they were flooded. They just have tremendous number of complaints and things and so on. But one of our panelists this morning was from CapitaLand. CapitaLand in China had very good whistleblowing from the tenderers who actually lost bids. And they always give very good information about how certain bids were won. So that was very good. So I think if there is really some very bad or illegal wrongdoing, opening out to people who really know the details is great, yeah. And then for the process, I would say that just let them know, but in a very simplified form, yeah.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. I know you had 2 parts. So is it covered? Okay, wait for the mic that's coming so we can hear you.
Thanks. Sorry. The other question I have in mind is about the gray area between when does whistleblowing policy kick in and when does it cross into a HR matter for example, for the HR committee to consider? How do we demarcate these 2 boundaries?
Can we demarcate
So
the
if it is a
boundaries?
whistleblowing from a staff member, there is a certain gray area between when does this person become a whistleblower and when is he considered, when is the matter considered under a HR matter?
Okay, anyone like to attempt? Carla, is it? Yeah, right.
I'm just going to share an experience. You're right, it could cross. 2 ways of dealing with it. One is the party who is the recipient of the whistleblowing needs to look at the issue and say that, okay, this is an issue relating to an employment practice or unhappiness or harassment, and then hand it to the right department to deal with it. But before it gets handed over, you need to know who the accused are as well, because if it's about the HR manager himself, then it doesn't make sense. But sometimes, even though it might be an employment-related issue, it might go into process. And that sort of process may not sit nicely within HR. And you might need to bring it into, if you have a whistleblowing committee, the whistleblowing committee or AC or somebody. So that recipient needs to be able to do the assessment and then pass it on.
Ramlee.
I think it depends on what's the issue being raised. My preference is always to have the whistleblowing issue addressed by a committee, even though it's an HR issue, because particularly if it's HR issue, then it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be anybody from HR sitting in the investigation committee. So it should be totally separate. Now, when after the investigation and it's clearly something to do with HR, or the person that is complaining is an issue and HR has to deal with it, that's a totally different matter, and it has to be really taken, the steps taken should be well thought out and with sensitivity.
Okay, so Hope that answers your question. Puay, did you want to jump in? Yeah.
Perhaps I think also the journey that we go through, that you need to train your staff, the differences between a personal grievance, which is really that personal matter, which is something to be addressed by HR, versus something which could be of public interest, right? So I think that part of training the staff, I think that is important.
So the question I really wanted to put as we were talking here is really this. So, Ramlee mentioned there should be a whistleblowing committee. And then we were talking about whether HR is the right person or right function for that. In your view, who should be the one that's actually driving or be responsible for such a whistleblowing? Who should be the go-to person for whistleblowing, really, within an organization?
Let me try starting first.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's the whole process that you will start with somebody receiving it, somebody assessing it, whether it is really a whistleblowing issue to the investigator, and ultimately it has to go to the board. Okay, the board has to be the one deciding, or even if the recommendation is after going through the investigation and say that there's not an issue, it has still got to go to the board for an, the
Okay, so the
confirmation.
board is ultimately responsible, is your point. Carla.
I think it's got to depend on the organization, for profit, not for profit, size of the organization. So recipient of the whistleblowing obviously has to be someone who's sufficiently senior, experienced, able to decipher what the issue is about. Do you have a whistleblowing committee? The size. If your charity or your organization is not very large, I don't think you want to have a whistleblowing committee. So it might be that it's two people. It might be the CFO, for example. But if it's a finance issue, there's a second person who's the recipient. I did one where it was the legal person who was the recipient, but if it was legal department, then there was an alternate recipient. And we structured it so well that neither would know whether the other was receiving something. And then it needs to go through the process. In terms of a committee to investigate, you can have a permanent whistleblowing committee, brilliant, but if you can't, it might be that you set up an ad hoc committee to look into the issue. And depending on the complexity of the issue, sometimes it's very simple, sometimes it's a non-issue. I don't think every single thing goes to the board to be cleared. I think board needs to be informed. So there should be, whenever the board meets, whether it's monthly or quarterly or whatever, at least a update in terms of what issues have come up, what issues have been viewed as not important, what is critical and is ongoing. I think that kind of reporting to the board is important. Because at the end of the day, the board is the mind and will of the entity.
Any thoughts, Ramlee?
I'm just speaking from experience. In the boards that I've been on for charity, the AC chairman or the finance committee chairman is deemed to be head of whistleblowing. So if there's any complaint or anything, whether from external or inter-party, he's the go-to man. Depending on the complaint, then he will discuss under the finance audit com and see who are required to do the investigation and what steps to be taken.
Okay, go-to
Very
man
good.
or woman, so we just have to be diversified. Chris.
I think in the corporate world, most of the organizations, they will go to the head of internal audit. And for charity, some of the charity organizations do have internal audit. So I think this could be the man to go to. Or usually if it's not audit, the legal person tends to be the one, because there will be certain laws involved, regulations, and they need to look into that carefully.
So I guess from what the panel's been saying, of course, there should be some sort of education of people in the organization to say, if it's a matter within this category, you go to this person. If it's the other part, then the other person is responsible for it, right? Another question from the floor. We have about 10 minutes, so we can take about 3 questions. Yes, there's a lady right down the center.
Hello, hi, good evening.
Hi.
I have 2 questions. My first question is for Ms. Carla. So if let's say there is a case of fraud or case of fraud, so the BOD decides to whistleblow. So I'm talking about vicarious liability. Is the BOD going to can the BOD be pinned down on the basis of vicarious liability? Is that a possible thing?
And your second question?
My second question is for Mr. Ong. So if there is a case of whistleblowing, or we found that misappropriation of fund, for example, do we have to report to the external auditor? Are we responsible to report to the external auditor? Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll get Carla first. Vicarious liability.
Question is, just to paraphrase it, so it's the company that has done something wrong. So, okay, it's always possible. It depends on what the issue is and who is the board whistleblowing to about what. So the complainant, the whistleblower. Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the structure. Maybe I'm a bit slow today. So we have an individual who has done something wrong and the board whistleblows on him. Okay. Then no, I can't see how the board should be vicariously liable or otherwise, because if they're whistleblowing on him, it's probably because it's a crime, it's fraud, it could be corruption, and whilst fraud and corruption on its own, it's not are not reportable offences. Still, if there's a crime committed, the board can decide whether they want to report. The board typically, and we've had this kind of scenarios a few times, the board typically will examine the nature of the violation, what is the message they want to send to the company as a whole, other employees, to third parties, and then make a call on should they complain. So if they complain, they might do it to CPIB, they might do it to police, to a financial regulator, depending. If that complaint is a genuine one, the board has no concerns. There's no repercussion on the board. So vicarious liability will not work there. Where vicarious liability can work is somebody has complained that there are things in the charity or company not going right, the things which are being done wrongly. So in the first instance, the company is going to be in violation, right? But is it at company level or is it one individual in the company? And is that something that the board ought to have picked up on? So that potentially can be a case of, so if the company is found to have violated and the violation is because of senior management and board didn't pick up on it, I'm making a leap because it's very factual, then yes, potentially members of the board could be liable because they are the mind of the entity.
Okay, Chris, come on in. Yours is a question of whether anything should be reported to the external auditors.
I think actually for charity it is not very clear, unlike the Companies Act, whereby a fraud of over 20,000 Singapore dollars must be reported. So I believe the board would have to make a judgment. If you consider it as a sort of petty fraud, you do not wish to report, it's okay. But if the amounts are large, I would see there's no other alternative except to report to the police. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Okay, I have to. Yes, lady in the center.
Following up on what you mentioned about the amount, okay, we are in the charities and ethics is important. So my question is, how do we, does the amount really matters, It is the ethics. If it is small amount we don't report, or the small amount we can gloss over, then doesn't it send a signal to the rest of the staff and the public that, yeah, if you can't be trusted on small things, then you cannot be trusted on bigger things. So I'd like to hear from your what we should be doing. Thanks.
Okay, interesting point of view there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I do agree that what is actually at stake is the ethics. But then the practical reality is that the board, if they decide to report to the police on every little fraud, they will actually have huge amount of work to do So
Who, police or the board?
the board will have to report to the police, so they will be involved. So if, let's say, there's stock take and then $10 is missing, then the board has to go to the police. Then, cash count, $50 for some reason cannot be accounted for. So at the end of the day, yes, it is relating to ethics, but surely there is an amount that the board may want to take, because it's quite, from my perspective, it's unlikely that you are going to talk to the police when the amount of loss is like a very, very small amount. So yes, ethics, but there's also the sort of cost effectiveness. And then if I push it to the region, it's quite different, although it's not totally relevant. In many countries, if you want the police to take action, the police have to be compensated. So imagine if you are reporting a fraud of like $50 and then the police force needs sort of processing fee of $500. Are you going to do that? Yeah.
Just use the mic so everybody can hear you, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I fully agree with it, in terms of cost benefit. But what I'm asking is, so how can we as a charity, instill that sort of culture, so internally, what should we be doing, so that it doesn't permeate, and doesn't get bigger in the future? So I'm talking about the internal governance issue, not reporting to police.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chris.
Yeah. Now, if you're not talking about reporting, then the answer is actually quite straightforward. Based on my past experience with quite a number of employers, if you steal 1 cent, you are fired. Because the message is very clear. If you can steal 1 cent, you can steal $1, you can steal $10. It's like the SIA case. He started with stealing a few $100. At the end of the day, he was stealing 21 million Singapore dollars.
Okay, there are many examples, including one that brought down a very long standing British bank many years ago.
No, I agree. I think take out the reporting part of it. I think you should take action against the employee that caused the issue, whether it's stealing or money missing from the till and so forth. At least a letter of warning if you're trying to be sympathetic or compassionate, but definitely an action should be taken. The message should be very clear. In respect to the reporting to external auditor, I don't think there is any regulation that requires you to do it. But I will be surprised if your external auditor don't ask whether do you know of any fraud occurring during the year? And if they ask you that, you should. Now, if it's your responsibility to report to the external auditor and that's part of your job scope, then I think you should do it, because you must do what you've been told to do.
So if let's say the board reported to made police report, and then they want to have a clean audit report, okay? So they don't inform the external auditor. Is that okay?
That's concealing information.
If it's a huge amount, any amount, I think that's concealing. I think the auditors would really look at the circumstances and the materiality of the thing and whether it's a total collapse of internal control. Then I think the board should not try to conceal it. If your board is trying to do that, I think you should reconsider your career choices.
Here's a view from an internal auditor.
Okay, I think when it's a question of ethics, I think there's no compromise, okay? Anybody do things that are not ethical, I think organizations should take a very strict stand. Now, if there is a fraud that happens, somebody steals something, I think I would think take a very strict action, right, against a person, but also look at the circumstances behind. What leads to the fraud? Is it your controls are not sufficient, or maybe you're not paying him sufficiently, right? So there must be reasons why. So I think beyond that, you've got to look through and analyze and then take action accordingly.
Carla, did you want to jump in?
It was a point I forgot just now as well, so I'm going to, and it came back, but I'll say it now. It's extremely idealistic, and I continue and I remain idealistic. I think at the end of the day, as board members, as management in charities or in any organization, really the only person you need to answer to is the person in the mirror. If you have kids, then I would dare say that the people you have to answer to are your kids. And it sounds completely childish or ridiculous for me to make these kind of comments, but honestly, at the end of the day, it's hand to heart. Can you answer to the person in the mirror when you do your job and you don't do it well? So your specific question about the $5, $10, the $20, it's theft. It's very clearly theft. If you discover it and you don't take action, then it comes down to the point that you've done. There is a procedural, the point you made, there's a procedural lapse and the control wasn't tightened. That could come back to bite the board in the future when the amounts are a lot larger. So that's realistic, a reality. But internally, I think I agree with what has been said in terms of you need to take some kind of action. It's not about firing the guy straight away, but it's about some kind of action that's taken to send the message through the organization, through shareholders, through members that we take these things seriously. And you know, 2 years ago, I was involved in firing an employee because the company had very strict policies on competition law, and this employee breached it. First time warning, breached it again, and he was senior enough. The company made the hard decision, fire. It was a message that had to be sent out to the rest. So needs to get done.
Okay, time for one last question. First hand goes up. And the mic's coming. Is that a question or a comment? Okay.
Just now, one of you mentioned that we can actually outsource this whistleblowing activity or maybe not responsibility. How far does this outsourcing work? Just answering the call and pass it back to the company for investigation, or they will do a string of investigation for us?
Okay. Anyone familiar enough to talk about this?
Anybody has this experience anyway from the not-for-profit?
Shared services for charities.
Yeah, we have, yeah. Generally, the scope is that we'll just take down the complaint and then pass it back to the organization for investigation. Because you really don't know sort of the scope of the investigation, and no outsourcer can actually quote you a fee and say that I'll take care of the investigation. So it's usually passed back. But of course, if you want the outsourcer to also take care of the investigation, then there will be a separate project fee.
To that last point that you just mentioned, of course, if you get the outsourcer to look into taking the call, answering the call, noting down whatever for documentation, does it actually include assessing the nature of the complaints before you send it back, or is it a pass-through, by the way, it's a mirror image?
There is an assessment. That means if it's something frivolous complaint, we will actually say that this looks to us is a frivolous complaint, and but you can still decide what action you would like to take. Yeah.
Okay. Hope that answers your question. Okay. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go down the panel now and ask them to give me one parting thought about this whole concept of whistleblowing, what's good, what's bad, what people should do or not do. Carla first.
It's the person in the mirror. I mean, I know it's never going to happen, but if we all can go with the attitude that we need to answer to the person in the mirror at the end of the day and be able to live with it, then whistleblowing, no whistleblowing, and all that, it doesn't work. I mean, you don't need it. But the problem is, not all of us go with that attitude. So do we need a whistleblowing policy? I think we do. Do we need an overarching legislation in the country? I think we do.
Cheh.
Okay, I just want to come in defense of auditors that you mentioned just now. No, I think auditors, there are different auditors, right? So when you get the auditors, you actually make sure that the auditors, when you select auditors, you make sure that you get them with the right experience. So if your sector is very unique, for example, in healthcare, you make sure you select an auditor who has done healthcare before. Okay, so that's very important. And the second thing is also when you scope out the work for to be done, if you limit that scope to be done and only that, they work on only that scope. So don't expect them to do beyond that scope. And also pay them a fair fee. Okay, I think it's very important. Pay them a fair fee. If you want to go for the lowest code, okay, the quality may be compromised. I'm not saying definitely it will be, but maybe compromised. So a fair fee is very important.
Okay, audit fee is not in the scope of discussion, but Ramlee.
I think taking into consideration all the matters that we discussed, I think whistleblowing is a necessary evil, I think, and it's going to be part of a life. It's very easy to make it as simple as possible if you want to, so that people can comply. But I think the thing that you need to do is make sure that everybody understands why you're doing it, how it's going to help the organization, especially when you're actually taking, you're the custodian of public money, whether it's company or people's money, and that's why it's important that we make sure that it's spent for the beneficiary.
And Chris.
Okay, I'll just sum out in a very simple mechanism, which I would say is CAR, CAR. So C is really the culture. You got the right culture. A is alert, being alert to problems. And finally, R is to report. So if you have the proper culture, your staff are alert and they report, you've achieved your whistleblowing mechanism.
Okay, I hope that's been a useful thought. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me to thank Carla, Puay, Ramlee, and Chris for sharing a lot of their insights in this. All right, thank you very much.